Hey everyone, welcome back to Making the Game, from concept to Kickstarter. In this podcast, I, Reese, the lead game designer for the game Bloodthrone, discuss the process of going from tabletop gaming idea through the development cycle to crowdfunding, production, fulfillment, and more. Our game Bloodthrone is still available for purchase via Game Found in the backer kit. If you are interested, you could head on over there and still get it at the crowdfunding exclusive discount prices if you're interested. In this episode, we will discuss the dice mechanics of Bloodthrone. So this is a big topic. Make sure to buckle up and be prepared. We'll cover where we started and how we got to where we ended up, because we have a fairly unique dice system now. Of course, there's nothing new under the sun, and I'm sure some of the avid board gamers out there will be like, oh, that sounds like this or that system. But for us, it was a unique journey, and I'll bring you along on that and the logic that we use to get from A to Z. Now, this is a big topic, so this podcast will be longer than usual. I apologize for that. Well, I'm always going to strive to stay at that 30 minutes or under mark. But this one, there was just a lot of ground to cover, so it will be a little longer. Also, I'm sorry that I'm running a little late on this one, but because it was such a larger topic, it did take me a couple extra days to get it all through the research, get the notes, recording and editing and all that. So before we dive in, I do want to give a quick status update on where we're at with Bloodthrone. We are finishing up the last set of molds, which is the most complex part. We are powering through the 2 remaining books. That is taking longer than I anticipated, but we just began the last piece of 2D art I need for the Hero expansion book, so that was a big milestone. And we got the majority of the graphic artwork done, and we got the last few models painted up and photographed. So that was some of the kind of the outliers. Now we're just in the final stages of editing and making sure that everything's as clear as it can be. And then, of course, we went through and redid all the cards, which was a huge task. But the final version, which I will be showing off probably in the next couple of days, they look great, and I think it's a big improvement, well worth the effort. We also redid the hero boards. The hero boards are sort of the at a glance, everything you need to know to play each individual hero. They're modular. So as they level up, you can put in, you can upgrade their stats. It tracks their HP, status effects, all that stuff. They look really cool. But we went through another revision with that to make it easier to read them, to just give it another layer of polish. And I think the end result was well worth the effort. We did hit one snag. It's a bit of a weird one. And I did say this earlier, but it's kind of come back to the forefront. The plastic organizer trays are going to delay us a couple of weeks, maybe as much as 6 weeks. And that's because the factory wasn't able to work on those because we hadn't finished giving them all of the physical components that they needed. So it was sort of a domino effect. Now, however, I did build 2 months padding into the schedule I put on the Kickstarter. So we're still within that, that sort of safety zone that I added in there, but we are going to be kind of running up against the butting up to the end of that. So now we're in a race to get everything done before Chinese New Year. Well, we need to ship before Chinese New Year, let me put it that way. So once we go into production, the production will be a month to 6 weeks. They have to box everything up, load it into a truck, and then the truck has to get to the dock, and then the container has to get onto a boat and on the water before Chinese New Year, because China shuts down for a month. So as long as we can get all this taken care of and get into production before the end of the year, we're looking still good to deliver by January. If we don't, that's going to cause a big delay. So I just had a meeting with the factory last week, and we're doing everything we can to avoid that from happening. But as long as I can get them everything they need to start working on the plastic organizer trays, which is a weird one, you wouldn't think that would delay things. They said that we're still looking good to stay on schedule. Lastly, in regards to the Sundrop style paint, that we're going to add as an option that you can have your models painted. It's a very simple paint job. You can have a full paint job as well through our paint studio if you want to go that route. But a lot of people have expressed interest in the Sundrop style painting, which is a simpler and cheaper version. I just talked to Cuttlefish Colors, who are our partner on that, and they're hoping to get me something that I can get some models painted and photographed. Hopefully this week. I think that might be a little aggressive at this stage. It's probably going to be more like next week. So hopefully I can get that done ASAP so that we can get that out there. People can see it, decide if they want it or not before we end the pledge manager. which that's looking like it's probably going to be end of August, September-ish. That's probably when the Pledge Manager will shut down. And lastly, the wholesaler order form will be going out today. I apologize for the multiple delays on that. I just had to coordinate with our logistics department in-house at Frontline Gaming to make sure everything was going right. And fortunately, the company's been really busy, so they took a while to get back to me, and I just wanted to make sure that everything was done right before I sent it out and potentially had an error on it. All right, so let's jump into the topic at hand, which are the dice mechanics for the game. Dice are one of the most quintessential and iconic aspects of tabletop games, along with cards, a game board, meeples, miniatures, whatever, in my opinion. Like when you think of board games, you typically think of dice and cards. These represent the randomness in a board game. They provide the opportunity for both exciting moments and heartbreaking disappointment. Some games lean very heavily into chance. Chutes and Ladders is the example I always use, where it's almost entirely random. And that's why it's a game aimed at young kids, because it's very simple to play, it's colorful, but in regards to actually playing a game that involves some degree of skill, it's at the minimal end of that. On the other end of the spectrum are games that have almost no random chance, like chess, which is a game of almost entirely player skill, and that's at the other end of the spectrum. Between these two extremes is where most board games are going to fall on that spectrum. So in designing a game like Bloodthrone, we want to lean more towards player skill and agency, but still have the opportunity for those exciting moments that chance brings. The comparison I like to make for games like Bloodthrone is that we want it to be closer to a system like poker in regards to managing chance, as opposed to, say, a game like roulette, where you have no influence on where the ball lies on the roulette wheel. Poker allows a savvy player to influence the outcome by managing their risk, understanding the odds, and enabling themselves to win more frequently than another player. Like if a game was truly random, it would be an equal distribution of winners and losers over time, over a large sample set. In a small sample set, you might have someone that wins a little bit more than others that go on a hot streak, but in a large sample set, it would be evenly distributed. However, in a game like poker, which is a game of chance, you have pro poker players that win, 20 times more frequently than a non-pro player. So that's sort of the sweet spot, in my opinion, with a game of chance, where the skill level influences the odds in your favor, but there still is that random chance, which brings the excitement. When we set out making Bloodthrone initially all those years ago, as I have stated previously, we were largely using D&D as a starting point. As such, we were using D20s as the primary mechanic for determining the success or failure of actions. So when making an action, you rolled a D20, you added your modifier attempting to hit a target number. Think like armor class is the most common example. The defender added any of their modifiers. If you equal or exceeded that threshold, you were successful. It's relatively simple and very familiar to most tabletop gamers. It gave us a familiar starting point to get the ball rolling. Beyond this, we had a few key design choices that mattered to us a great deal. For one, we wanted the acting player to succeed more often than not. One of the things that annoys me to no end in games like D&D or Pathfinder or whatever is when you're low level and you wait for your turn. Sometimes it can be 10-15 minutes before you get to actually act. You roll your probably one attack or one action, and then you miss very frequently. Then you have to wait again for your turn. It's just not fun. So in those kind of RPGs, you do go God mode at high level, but the average D&D party only gets to level 4 according to their own data on D&D Beyond. So the reality is that the average D&D player or Pathfinder player or whatever is spending a lot of their time whiffing, and it's just lame. It's not fun. So we wanted to front load our system so that the heroes were powerful right from the word go. Right? That's why you start out with a lot of skills and then you slowly gain more as you go through the game. We wanted everyone to be good right away, and we wanted the acting player to succeed more often than not because it's just more fun. So to that end, we would have, a lower armor class, if this was D&D, than would be normal, just to maximize the odds of the player being successful in their action. Now, of course, that's a simplified example, but it gives you kind of an idea of how we moved the stats in favor of the acting player. The system worked fairly well, but one of the things that bothered me the entire development cycle was watching people play the game and constantly having to do low-level math in their head, which added quite a bit of cognitive load. As an example, in a D20-based system, such as with D&D or Pathfinder, etc., let's say you have a +5 modifier rolling to hit against a monster that has an evasion of 13 or armor class. And again, in Bloodthorn Evasion would be the equivalent to that. You have a bonus to hit for being in the rear arc, and the monster also has a bonus to their evasion due to some sort of effect or cover, whatever the case may be. So to determine what you need to roll to hit, you have to look at the target number with their modifiers, subtract your bonus to hit with your modifiers, and then you come to the number that you have to roll equal to or better to succeed, or you do it the inverse where you add your number, come up with the total, and then compare it to the modified target threshold. Now, that doesn't sound too crazy, as most of us are used to doing it playing games like the D20 system games. Other miniature games use D20s as well, like Infinity, for example. And when you are just rolling 1 or 2 actions for one character and then you're waiting for your turn, it's not really that big of a deal. In a game like Bloodthorn, where you are making lots of actions for each hero and you're usually controlling multiple heroes, it starts to become mentally draining. The other issue I have with the D20 or any linear progression system is that the cumulative bonuses to offense and defense as you and the monster scale up are largely meaningless. For example, if you have a low-level monster that's evasion 10, I'm just making numbers up here, and your hero has a +3 to hit, but through leveling and equipment, etc., you eventually get to another +3, so you're at a +6 to hit, but then the monsters are scaling up too, and then their evasion goes up to 13. What you gained was largely meaningless, right? The math just gets more complicated. Like, instead of evasion 3 versus 10, it's 6 versus 13, but the statistics haven't changed at all. Your odds to hitting are the exact same as they were before. Further, in a linear system like this, you do not actually have 20 numbers worth of variables in practice to work with. If a 1 always fails and a 20 always succeeds, that removes 10% of the total range of probability. For each point of modification you have above the target defense, you gain 5% bonus to hit until you approach a near certainty of 95%. And in reverse, for each number below the threshold, you have a 5% penalty approaching a near certainty to miss of 5%. 5% chance to hit. Defensive stats also must be arbitrarily higher than the offensive modifiers for the math to work. For example, if you have an evasion of 1, or an armor class of 1, the attacker can only ever miss if they roll a 1, regardless of their positive modifiers to hit, because you cannot roll below a 1. So your default 95% chance to hit, therefore, nothing's ever going to use those numbers, or even anything close to that range. Because if you're at a evasion 5, and someone's +4 to hit, you're back in the same boat that you were before, with it being an almost certainty. And then vice versa, if you had someone with an evasion or a threshold of 20, for example, kind of getting towards maxing out, you start to run out of runway. Since you can't roll above a 20, you get into a situation where the maximum ceiling starts to get diminishing returns, because if someone starts stacking tons of modifiers, like in a D&D system where you have +15 to hit or whatever, that 20 doesn't really seem that great, and then you start going into this weird realm of getting up to like 30, where it's pointless. You're just adding tons of numbers, and you're still limited by that 1 to 20 range, but the range of numbers that are actually viable are really limited, right? So in that example, if you had a super awesome level 20 D&D, whatever, and you have a static +15 to hit, that means that 16 and down are no longer numbers that are viable because they don't do anything. They might as well be 1 or 0. Another example that's a little bit easier to understand, to contextualize this, is one of my favorite miniatures games, which is Warhammer 40k and Age of Sigmar. They use D6s. In the current edition of those games, they have a set number to hit on the acting model stat card. So a really easy example, Space Marine, most people are familiar with what a Space Marine is. They hit things on a 3+ in shooting or in melee, usually. As you cannot have a model that hits on a 1+, as that would just be an automatic success. That means you effectively have, a range between 1 and 5. You don't want to have a 6+ to hit, because that would just be oppressive and not fun outside of, really rare circumstances. So that means the range of numbers that are actually viable are like 2 to 5. And when you look further into the games, it's like exceptional models will be a 2+ to hit because the odds are so beneficial. And what you really end up with is a range of 3 to 5. Right? 5 being very bad, 3 being good, 4 being middle of the road. It doesn't leave a lot of room to differentiate between all the different units. However, in a game like that, where you're rolling tons of dice at a time, it's better to be simplified. But you do lose the granularity that makes an RPG-style game fun. So this helps to illustrate the problem described above on the D20 range of not really getting the full range of numbers to use. Combined with the design principle we set out above of wanting the acting model to succeed more often than not, all things being equal, our range of variables became even more limited. For example, in D&D, the reason why you miss all the time when you're low level is because they start with a lower probability of success, and then they allow you to work up from there. It gives you more runway going forward. But it's not fun, right? Like the end result is that it's always this like waiting to get good feeling in D&D, and most games don't go long enough, as I already mentioned. To give another example to sort of drive this idea home, this principle, let's say the evasion of a monster was 10 and the modifier of the acting model, like a hero trying to hit it, was 0. You would succeed 55% of the time, needing a 10 through 20 to succeed, again, because we use the equal or better method. Typically, if a hero was doing the thing that they were meant to do, like say a fighter punching you, they would have a bonus of between 2 to 6 to whatever it is that they're good at. We'll use 4 as an example because that's a pretty common modifier. This means you would succeed on a 6 plus, right? So 6 plus 4 would be 10, and you would have a 75% chance to succeed, and that's the range where we wanted to be. That was our target percentage, was 75% to succeed doing the thing that your character, your hero, was meant to do. All right, so therefore the average evasion would have to be in the range of 10 to like 10 plus, right? In order for it to fit within that threshold that we were aiming for. Anything above 15 starts to get really difficult. It means you're going to start missing more than you're hitting. And then if you get up to 20, you only have a 25% chance of success if you have an average bonus of 4, right? So those numbers don't really become viable, right? Outside of like an edge case, like let's say you wanted to make a monster that was like, super hard to hit, but you know, if you hit him once, you killed him, like you had 2 hit points or whatever. There is room for those because that's fun. But typically speaking, you're going to have to stay within this range of like 8 being extremely easy to hit. Because then again, if you're a +4, you'd only have to roll a 4 to be successful, which means the failure points are 1, 2, 3, which is only a 15% chance of failure. So that's like getting to the point where it's like almost an automatic. And then again, like I said, once you start going too high, it becomes really, really difficult. So your effective range of numbers becomes even more limited. To further complicate it, you also need room for improvement, right? Like you want to be able to get better as you level up, increase your stats, take new abilities, find magical items, etc., etc. So you need to be able to have room for that going up as well within the range of numbers. So that means your starting point is getting even more limited. And then further, as I stated before, you want room to have specialized heroes and monsters, right? Like we want Downland, for example, the rogue, to be hard to hit, but fairly squishy. And then you have a monster like the Butcher of Ruin, who is slow and extremely easy to hit, but he has high armor and tons of hit points, right? So you also need room within that little sphere that keeps shrinking to have these archetypal characters that really are what make this kind of a game fun and unique. So what this all means, in effect, is that the 1 to 20 range of variability is actually a red herring. In the example above, the sweet spot would be like 8 to 14, as I said. Lower becomes almost automatic, higher becomes very unlikely. And then you also have to have room for something like the Tatiana the Dreadmage Wizard, who's going to be very poor in melee, but you don't want it to be like a 10% chance to succeed, because then it's just like, it becomes solely pointless, right? You want it to be viable for that kind of a character to have at least a puncher's chance of succeeding by bonking someone on the head with their staff. So the conclusion that I came to was that the only thing that actually matters is the difference between the defensive and the offensive thresholds, right? The defensive threshold and the offensive modifier, right? So unless you're at the extremely low or high end of the 1 to 20 range, in which case the math gets totally distorted for the reasons I said above, because you run out of runway, you can't go below 1, you can't go above 20. Really, the only thing that matters is the difference between the attacker and the defender, right? That differential is the thing that is actually meaningful. If you were to somehow eliminate the D20 and simply focus on that differential between acting model and model being acted upon, you will unhitch yourself from that arbitrary range of numbers that the D20 or any die provides. Early on, we had experimented with D10s because the mental math was a lot easier, but the problems that I just outlined in depth with a limited range of numbers is exacerbated with a D10, right? So you're still forced into the middle of the range, and then there's even less room for differentiation between a rogue and a priest, for example, and all their specialties. And there was less room for leveling up and all that sort of stuff. It just made the situation more complex. Towards the end of the development cycle, I started looking deeply at other systems for dice mechanics. As stated earlier, one of the issues I found with the existing system was the cognitive load began to wear players down towards the end of a game. Players in practice would look at the target number, just roll the die, look at their modifier, and then they just go like, yeah, I think that hits. And the other player would usually just be like, yeah, I think that hits, just to keep the game moving along. And they weren't taking the steps to actually do it accurately, which made a lot of the work we put into the system sort of pointless. Because it was, it was usually accurate, but you might be off by 5-10%. And it just became burdensome to constantly be doing that math in the teens range to low 20s is where the game ended up a lot of the time. Or if it was, if your target threshold was below 12, for example, you would usually just be like, oh, it's like a 1, as long as I don't roll a 1 or 2, it hits, and you just didn't go beyond that. I would do it myself. This really didn't sit well with me, so I spent a long time thinking about ways to change the dice system, to keep the crunchiness of the system, to keep the room for specialization, to keep the room for scaling up with leveling, but to keep it simple. So I started experimenting with tons of ideas. Like, I looked at so many different dice systems for different games. Resources like Board Game Geek were really useful. There's tons of theory, or tons of really, really smart people on that are like insanely, passionate about tabletop gaming and math. There was some other forums and blogs and such that I was reading that were great with the theory. I read like every rule book I could get my hands on. I downloaded tons of PDFs. I really dug into it. And some of the games that I felt like had the systems that were going to come close to accomplishing what I wanted the most were games like Marvel Crisis Protocol, which I think is a brilliant game, Shatterpoint. Looked at Warcry 2 because it had some really interesting dice mechanics. And I kind of like took all that down and put it into some notes. From there, I put together some dice calculators. I used some that are online, some common resources. I also made some myself using spreadsheets. And I'm not going to lie, I went to ChatGPT a lot to help give me a crash course in statistics. I was an English major in college, so I took one math class, and it was so easy that the professor told me to stop coming halfway through because I already had an A. No, and I'm not bragging. That's just how dumb the math was for an English major in college. So I never got to statistics in my formal education, but ChatGPT plus talking to my friends who are math-oriented people and just reading a ton of things online really helped me bring me up to speed. Now, that said, I am definitely not a statistician, not even close. I just learned the things I needed to learn to do what I was trying to do. So some of you out there that are math-oriented people might be laughing at what I'm saying right now, but hey, we all work with the skill sets that we have. And odds are, if you're a math-oriented person, you probably wouldn't want to do all the creative writing that came a lot easier for people with a background like myself. So at any rate, what I ended up coming up with was a completely new system, at least to me. I'm sure there's other games out there that have done it before. Like I said at the beginning of this podcast, there's nothing new under the sun, but it was new. It was new to me. And the key idea that was driving what we were doing was that the set range of variables was the limiting factor more so than anything else. So we needed a model that didn't rely on these arbitrary limitations. We wanted to focus on the differential between offense and defense, with the idea that we wanted the acting player to succeed more often than not because it's more fun. And if a player were to invest really heavily into maxing out defense on a hero, like when you're making your own, then you should be rewarded for that. That hero should be very, very hard to hit. However, when you're making a character, you have a limited amount of points to allocate. So that would come at a pretty steep trade-off, meaning that your offense would be really lacking, or you'd be lacking in some other area, right? So you still can make someone that's like annoyingly hard to hit or has an insane amount of hit points or whatever, but you're going to be sacrificing something else in order to do that. So with that in mind, we wanted the average scenario to be the acting player succeeds at the thing that their hero is good at because that feels good. And we wanted the heroes to be strong out the gate so that you're not always waiting for this distant point. And at level 14, my character really comes together. In Bloodthorn, you start strong, and then you get incrementally stronger as you go, and then you can customize your hero as you go. So that was really important to us. Lastly, we wanted a system that didn't have the heavy cognitive load so that the players could quickly just roll the dice, see if they succeeded, and then move on, right? Without having to do a bunch of mental math. Sounds easy, right? Well, let me tell you, it was not. I spent literally weeks only working on this, just like all day, going on long walks, thinking about it, coming back, running the numbers through the calculators that I had built, learning all these equations with symbols that look like they're from Greek hieroglyphics or I'm sorry, Egyptian hieroglyphics, or they're written in Greek. I learned a lot. It was actually a really fun process to become better educated in math. And then again, I would have my friends and ChatGPT like go and look at it and make sure I wasn't making any really obvious errors. So the system that I ended up coming up with was as follows. Instead of a D20, we switched to 2D8. So I ran the numbers on 2D6, 2D4, 2D8, 2D10, 2D12 to see where we wanted to be. And the D8 was kind of the sweet spot, in my opinion. So there's a number of reasons for this. For one, it gives you more variability than the D6, and it's easy to read a D8. So one of the key things about the D6 is they're very common. They're very easy to read. It's easy to roll a handful of them. And you start to get kind of like, when you start going above a D8, not necessarily adding anything really. Like I initially thought 2D10 would be perfect because it makes the math so easy. You're going up and down 5% increments typically. But D8s give enough variability, plus they're easy to read, that I was like, yeah, I feel like this is the sweet spot. And after doing all the research that I did, it made me kind of have a greater appreciation for Asmodee games, which I think they make really good games. And they use D8s almost exclusively. Sorry about that. The dog was going crazy. But as stated, we wanted a baseline of roughly 75% chance to succeed in actions when the acting player is doing the thing that they're meant to be doing, right? Now, again, if going back to the example of Tatiana, the wizard trying to bonk someone with her staff, maybe that shouldn't be 75%. Maybe that should be closer to 50 or 60%, right? But like when you're doing the thing that your character is meant to do, you should succeed more often than not. Now, since we decided that the probability was the thing that we wanted, not some arbitrary number on a 1 to 20 scale, it became pretty straightforward, right? Because like on a D20, you have equal odds of rolling a 1 as you do a 20, as you do any other number. And games like War Machine famously use a 2D6 system because it gives you a bell curve of results, wherein roughly half of the time, roughly a little less than that, you'll come up with a result of a 6, 7, or 8, because there's so many combinations that can give you that. So it's a much more predictable range of results. Now, in a 2D anything system, if you want a 75% chance to succeed, it's really simple. You just make half the symbols on both dice give you the result that you want. Meaning if you needed a 4 plus on a D6 on either die in order to succeed, that means that the possible outcomes are 4 or higher on both dice, on one or the other die, or on neither die, right? So the only situation in which you fail is if you roll a 1, 2, 3 on both dice, which is a 25% chance, giving you a 75% chance of succeeding. It's very easy. It's like flipping 2 coins. And so obviously on a D8, it would be a 5 plus, but we used symbols instead of numbers, and I'll explain that in a little bit. It'd make things easier. And so how modifiers would interact with that is they move the percentage up or down, and you're not stuck within this arbitrary framework of between 1 and 20, although, as I explained earlier, it ends up going way above 20 as you scale up. The other cool thing with this system is that if half of the dice faces of 8 of the total 16 dice faces on a 2d8 are the hit symbol, which is in our case is an explosion, represents a hit or a success, that gives you 8 other die faces that you can mess around with game mechanics, right? So again, going back to a game like Marvel Crisis Protocol or Shatterpoint, they do a really good job with this, and we took a lot of inspiration from that because I think they're brilliant games. But in a nutshell, with our system, when you're rolling the action dice, which again is 2d8, if you see a hit on either die, you succeeded. It's that easy. You don't have to do any other math. The cognitive load is very low. So now let's discuss how modifiers work within this framework. So as I said multiple times, the only thing that really matters in this kind of a system, in this like versus system, is the differential between the target threshold and then the active modifier. And one thing that I had noticed is that any math at or under the number 10 is mega easy for people. It's almost thoughtless. Above 10, people have to stop and think, right? So as an example, 2 minus 3 is 1. You don't even have to really think about it. But 7 minus 18, maybe it takes you a little bit longer. You have to go, oh, this is 11. And so by eliminating the need for an arbitrary starting point, because again, with the D20 system, the defense has to be higher than the offense for it to even function. Otherwise, it's just automatic and there's almost no point in rolling the dice. Like think THACO, right? Like 2-hit armor class 0, which was the original D&D system. When you get rid of that, you can dramatically reduce down the differential, and the variables become much easier to manage because you have a floor of 0 effectively, right? And then you go up from there. Generally, it's gonna be very rare that you go above 10. Evasion can, but that's only at high level, and it's not very common. So the way this works in practice is the defending player, the player controlling the model being acted upon, looks at their relevant defensive stat. It'll tell you a number of, we call them block dice, they're blue dice. and they plop them down. And that number is usually going to be between 1 and 10. Again, it's usually more in the middle of that range. So let's just say 4. And then the acting player, the controller playing the model that's performing the action, looks at their relevant offensive stat, and they plop down those dice. They're white dice, and you just take the difference between them. So in this instance, in this example that we're using, let's say your offensive modifier was 3, the target threshold was 4. You put down 3 white dice, they put down 4 blue dice. You just take the difference between them, just 1 blue die, and you roll that with your action die. That's it. It's extremely easy. And again, you're looking for those explosion symbols to succeed. You're not having to do any arbitrary math of like, oh, I need to hit a 13 or whatever. The math is still there, but it's the dice are doing a lot of the work for you. So to finish out this example that we're talking about, what would that defensive modifier do in the example that we use, right? So the defensive modifier was higher than the offensive modifier, so you have 1 blue die in addition to your action dice. The defensive dice have 1 skull on them. If a skull pops up, it's a critical failure, which causes the action to fail regardless of any other die results. So in this example, let's say you got really lucky on your action dice and you rolled 2 explosions. You're like, yeah, hit. But then on the blue die, that 1 in 8 or 12.5% chance to get that skull pops up. That's a critical failure. It overrides the 2 hits. So then let's say you kept adding, let's say the defensive modifier was 5 instead of 4, and there was 2 blue dice in there. Each one of those has a skull. That is increasing the odds that one of them comes up a skull. But now the way the math works is that it's a decreasing amount. The penalty is decreasing because there's a chance that both of them come up a skull, but that doesn't matter, right? Because you only need one of them to. So roughly, this is simplifying the math quite a bit. The first one is a minus 10%, and then it's minus 9, 8, 7, 6, and it starts getting less and less from there. But that as a rule of thumb, that gives you an idea of the way that works. Now, we really like this because the diminishing returns you get from pumping up a stat, it reduces the incentive to min-max your character, right? Since you get the most bang for your buck in those first few stat points, it gives you an incentive to spread out your stats a little bit more, and not just, anytime you're playing a fighter in D&D, you max their strength or whatever, or intelligence for a wizard or whatever the case may be. Now, you can still do that, and there still is a benefit. It's just not as pronounced as it would be in a linear system. Now, in the other direction, let's say in that example that we've been using, the monster had a defensive modifier of 4, and your offensive modifier was 5. So you're 1 above them. So now when you roll the action dice, instead of adding any blue dice, which were negative, or block their defensive dice, you add in an offensive dice, or a damage die is what we actually call them, and that's a white die. Now, just like the blue dice, having 1 skull, the white dice have 1 explosion on them. So that's increasing your odds of having any of the dice come up an explosion, right? So then again, like with defensive modifiers, the offensive modifiers start increasing the odds that you get at least 1 explosion, but it's diminishing returns. It doesn't, the math's a little bit different because again, we started at 75%, not 50%, for example, where it would scale up and down equally. So the scaling up is slower, but you already started in a good spot. So it's increasing your odds, just it's not as dramatic of a change to the probability as when you're going down. Now, in order for this system to stay simple, because as you can see, it's extremely simple. You look at your offensive stat and their defensive stat, you take the difference. It's usually extraordinarily simple math, like 6 minus 3 or whatever. So it goes extremely quickly. Now, in order to keep this simple, we needed to minimize the opportunities to increase the numbers of dice, right? Like, we wanted it to be, look at your stat, look at their stat, go. So there's extraordinarily few ways to add offense or defensive dice when you're playing the game, right? The Bard Song of the Phoenix is one of the only ones that can do that. He has an AoE that can add 1 offensive or 1 defensive dice to his buddies. And that's super strong and that's cool. And it's, when you're making a game like this, the heroes break the rule to show how they're cool, right? But that's one of the only ways to do it. They're very limited, right? So you're almost always just going stat to stat, boom, roll the dice. And then you're simply looking for that explosion symbol, or if there's negative modifier dice, you're also looking for the skull symbol. It's very, very quick. And again, compare this to a D20 system where you could be adding 7, and then they're starting out at 14 and adding 3, so it's like, okay, 14 plus 3 is 17. I'm at a 7, so then 17 minus 7 is 10, so I need to roll a 10 or better. It's the system we came up with is much, much smoother. But the math still remains pretty similar. Now, again, like I said, the first negative modifier is minus 10, whereas in a straight D20 system, it would be minus 5. So it's not exactly the same, but the granularity was close enough that we felt like we still had that crunchiness that we wanted. Or compare it to like 40K or Age of Sigmar, like I was saying before, where it's extremely simple. Like our system is more complex than theirs, where it's like, hey, you just roll a 3+ on a D6 and this guy hits with his gun or whatever the case may be. So that's at the other extreme of it being really simple. But then again, in a game like that, you could be playing with 200 models. You need it to be simple, otherwise the game would take forever. So in a party-based system, like real effectively like a skirmish-style board game, you have room and you want to have that crunchiness, you want to have that granularity, so that again, you can differentiate why is the ranger really good with his bow and the wizard's not, and then also have room for them to increase and scale up without it making the math really burdensome. Now, all that said, we still wanted to have ways to increase your odds while playing the game. Now, like I said, outside of the game, when you're leveling up characters and giving them new loot, you'll increase their stats. Like in the running example we've been using, let's say your one of your heroes is +3 to hit with melee, and then outside of combat, you level up, and then you go up to +4. And then on their hero board, you just cover up the 3 with a little token that says 4, so then when you're playing the game, again, you're doing the same thing, but that ability to change things is still there. Now, while you're playing the game, we really wanted the ability to get those modifiers, right? So how do you do that without complicating the math, right? Because that was one of our primary design principles. In a game like Bloodthrone, movement and positioning are keys to success, and that was a design choice that was really important to us, right? It was one of the fundamental things we wanted to include the game, is that how you move your models around the table is going to have a huge impact on your success in playing the game. Like, for example, finding ways to flank your opponent, getting behind them gives you is very advantageous, right? It's very beneficial to you to do that. So then the skill in the game is coming in, how do I figure out a way to get one of my models behind another model to gain a benefit in becoming successful in doing the thing I want them to do. So that's where we came up with what we called the advantage system. So the advantage system is quite simple in theory. It allows you to ignore any symbol when you're rolling for an action, and in certain specific circumstances, you can activate some symbols, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So what that would let you do in effect is, for example, let's say you had a negative modifier. You were rolling your action dice plus blue dice because their defensive stat was higher than your offensive stat, and you get that skull. Well, if you had one advantage, you could ignore the skull, right? So the model positioning is critical, and you can start stacking these advantages to manipulate the dice, but you do it after you roll. So they're basically like plus and minus ones to hit or whatever the case may be, but you don't have to think about it until after you roll the dice. So you roll like, oh, I got an explosion, but I also got a skull. I have an advantage. I'm going to turn the skull off. Now, conversely, if you're like, oh, I rolled an explosion and no skull, you don't even have to think about it. There's nothing to use the advantage on. Just move forward, right? So it's a +1 that only kicks in when you actually need to apply it. I'll give you another example. Let's say you have one of your hero models that's got into a monster's rear arc. That gives you an advantage. You charged. That gives you another advantage. And then you have another hero that's engaged with that monster attacking him. You have a team up. That gives you 3 advantage. So then even if you were rolling like 4 negative modifier dice, you have the opportunity to ignore like up to 3 of those skulls as long as you got an explosion on one of your action dice, right? So you can really start to alter the odds in your favor. And again, going back to that poker example I used at the beginning of the podcast, it allows the skilled player to manipulate the odds in their favor and become victorious more often than not because of any random thing, but it's because they played the game intelligently. Now, there are other ways to gain advantage in the game. Most of it's through model positioning, but it can also be from like a beneficial status effect that you gain. Like, for example, Amara, who is the warlord character in the core box, she issues out orders. She's like a battlefield commander. She can issue an order that would give a allied model an advantage in addition to other benefits as well. Now, the nice thing about the advantage system, as I said, is that it only matters when it matters, right? You only have to think about it after you roll the dice. So you roll the bones, I got an explosion, no skull, I'm good. I don't really need to think about advantage outside of activating symbols, which I will now explain that. So now this is very simple. It only comes up in a couple of limited circumstances, generally speaking. So on the D8s, as I had mentioned earlier, we're only using 8 of the total 16 faces between the 2D8. That gives us 8 other symbols that we can use. Now, 2 of them on each die are just blanks, which is that's a miss, and those can't be modified by advantage. So we had to include in there enough probability taken up that it's just a failure to keep it interesting, right? You didn't want to have a situation where you have advantage and you're just like, I don't even need to roll the dice. I'm automatically going to succeed. So there goes 4 more, but now that leaves us with 4 additional faces, 2 per die. So one of each of those is a swirl. And it's kind of a wild, but the most common application for that is you can use an advantage to turn a swirl into an explosion. So let me give you a concrete example of how that would work. Say you're rolling an action dice, you roll a blank and a swirl. Normally you would miss. If you had one advantage, you could turn that swirl into a hit. Now you hit. Here's a more complex example. Say you have 2 negative modifier dice, one of them comes up a skull, and then on your action dice, you rolled a blank and a swirl. Well, now if you have 2 advantage, you could turn off that critical failure, turn on the swirl, and then you go from a critical failure to a hit. Now, the other example of where you can commonly use advantage to activate a symbol are what we call black explosions. So as I said, an explosion means a success when you're attempting an action. Each of the action dice has 4 explosions. 3 of them are white, 1 of them is black. Normally, that doesn't mean anything, right? It only matters if you have a special rule in effect, like having advantage. So the way that works, if you were to roll and you were to get a black explosion, you had 1 advantage, you can activate that, it becomes a critical hit. So what that does is when you go to the damage step, you replace a normal damage die with a raw damage die. They're red. And those are like critical hit dice, and they're used with some spells and poison and things of that nature. But it lets you incrementally increase the power of your whatever you're trying to do. So let's say you had 2 advantage and you came up with 2 black explosions, you would be able to replace 2 normal damage dice with 2 critical hit dice. And if your dice pool has a positive modifier, meaning like, for example, you're +4 to hit, you're attacking a monster that's got 3 defense, you have 1 positive modifier die in your dice pool, the explosion on the positive modifiers, the damage dice or the offensive dice, however you want to describe them, they're all black explosions, right? So if you're +7 to hit and you're going after a monster or an opposing hero model that's a 4, you would be rolling your action dice +3 positive modifier dice, and there's a potentiality to get 5 black explosions. Now, it's extremely unlikely that would occur, but that's the way that works, right? So the more you stack the odds in your favor, the more you position your model correctly, the more you're attacking in a beneficial scenario, the more likely you are to succeed and to get critical hits as well. And to that effect, right, again, to lean into this skill over chance aspect that was really important to us when designing the game, all models in the game have 3 static defenses. We've been talking about evasion, which is like armor class in D&D. That represents how hard you are to hit with normal, call it mundane attacks. In the vast majority of the time you're using, I wouldn't say vast majority, the majority of the time you're using evasion, but you also have 2 other special defenses. One is fortitude and the other is will. Fortitude defends against special attacks that attack your body, like poison or being pushed, things of that nature. Will defends against things that attack your psyche, your spirit, your mind, a lot of magical attacks, or like verbal type attacks will affect your will. So that gives you the option to try and use your special actions, which are usually represented by your class skills, to bypass evasion, because evasion is almost always higher. Not always, but typically it's the higher defense. To give you an example, Ajax, the fighter in the core box, he's the party's tank. He has sky-high evasion and fortitude. Like, he's very hard to hit. But his will is 1, which is basically, you can go to 0, but 1 is effectively as low as it gets. So he's really vulnerable to special attacks that attack the mind or the spirit, but he's very, very resilient to physical attacks. So as an aside, when you're picking your special abilities for your heroes, which again, you can do that before each game, usually it's class skills, but it can also be magic items or mundane items. You want to make sure that you have a selection of abilities that can get around evasion, right? So if you find yourself, they can bypass any of the static defenses, right? So if you're finding yourself against a monster that has really high evasion, you're like, oh man, this is gonna be hard to actually affect them. Oh, but I have a special attack that attacks fortitude, and this monster has really low fortitude. You want to have that in your arsenal so that you don't find yourself in a situation where you don't really feel like you can do anything, or the odds are really stacked against you. Lastly, to round out the action dice, the last 2 symbols on the dice have the unlucky symbol. This, in the early game, and especially in the core game, it doesn't come up a lot. This is future planning. It does come up, it's just not as relevant in the early game. But basically, it's like opposite. It's like disadvantage. It's like the opposite of advantage. So, for example, if you have a status effect, unlucky, you treat that symbol as a critical failure, right? So it comes up more as you scale up in the game, and then the expansion heroes take more advantage of it. But that's what that does. It's like an inverse advantage that's built into the dice, and it only matters if you have a status effect on you that's activating those symbols. And that clearly has a pretty dramatic reduction on your chances of success, because if either one of them comes up, the unlucky symbol, while you have that status effect, you fail, regardless of any other dice results. So the end result is a system that once you do it a couple times, it's incredibly easy to use, but it has a lot of design space for adding in tons of cool mechanics. You have room to scale up and down almost infinitely. You can level up, you have room for specializing, and the dice are doing a lot of the math for you, and it's really reducing the cognitive load. It's making it very simple. In effect, and I know I've been talking for a long time, but in effect, you look at your offensive modifier, you look at the defensive modifier, you take the difference, which is usually a very low number, roll it with your action dice, you see an explosion, you hit. If you don't, you miss. If there's a score, you miss. That's it. Really simple. If you have advantage because you position yourself well, you apply that after you roll the dice if you need it. So when you're playing the game, you always want to try and stack those advantages to put the dice odds in your favor, and you'll find that the game rewards intelligent play. All right, phew. Now on to damage and defense. So again, this podcast is running longer than normal, but hopefully that information you're finding to be valuable and interesting. So the damage system went through a similar evolution as the action dice system did. Initially, we were using dice that you would use in an RPG, right? D8s, D4s, D6s, a longsword did D8, a dagger was D6 for us, a longbow was D10. Really, really familiar, right? And again, we started there because it was what we knew, it was what we were familiar with. Now, the downside to this system, very similar to the D20 system in my opinion, is that, for example, if you're shooting a longbow at someone, you're just as likely to do 1 damage as you are to do 10. So if you actually hit someone, it's really annoying when you roll a 1, and then it's also really annoying when you roll a 10, and when you add in your power mechanic, which I'm going to explain shortly here, and you just kill like a wizard, for example, in one shot. Neither one of those is fun. Maybe the second situation is fun for the one doing it, but it's certainly not fun for the person that it's getting done to. So to explain the power mechanic, a core part of the design process and one of the philosophies that we wanted was that the stats of the character to be able to increase damage and healing, etc. So this is very common in RPGs. This is nothing groundbreaking. You know, in D&D, you usually add your strength or whatever the case may be to the damage done, and we wanted to do the same thing. This also leaves room for improving as you level up by increasing your stats, gaining new equipment, etc., etc., etc. Again, nothing new. Now, the issue with a linear system, as I have described in this podcast, is like, let's say you have a static +4, right? And now in the example that we were just using with the longbow, now instead of being able to do 1 to 10, you're going to do 5 to 14, right? That's it. So again, if you roll that 10 and you just one-shot someone, it's not very fun. Plus, the minimum threshold is dramatically higher. So you end up in a situation where you're incentivized to min-max, which again, like D&D or Pathfinder is what you typically do. And it's obvious why you would do that, right? Like you're reducing variability from the range of results. Instead of going 1 to 10, I'm going 5 to 14. That's dramatically better. Now, the downside to that is that you end up with kind of cookie cutter characters, right? Like every ranger is going to maximize the stats that are going to make him the best at shooting his bow. Every wizard is going to maximize his stats to make him do more damage or have more spells, etc., etc. So initially what we did is we decided to increase the die category. So, for example, if you had a dagger, for us does D6. It initially doesn't now. I don't want to confuse anybody. That was in the early days. Let's say you had +2 power, you would go up to a D8 to a D10. So now you've increased the potentiality for the damage output, but not the minimum threshold. So roll a 1, you might roll a 10. And inversely, armor in Bloodthorn is very simple. It's a straight damage reduction. You would go down a die category. So let's say in that example, you went up to D10 because you had 2 power. Power in our game is like a combination of physical, mental strength, could be skill. We didn't want it to just be physical strength because it could be represented in a ranger shooting his bow or whatever the case may be. So we just called it power, which also usually increases healing. So you went up to a D10, someone had armor 1, you would go back down to a D8. It was a good system, really. It worked well, but it didn't eliminate the problem with the variability of rolling a single die. Now, where it really got wonky is when you went above a D12. And yes, there are D14, 16s, 18, 20, 22, blah, blah, blah. We had all the way up to D30. And it got really confusing once you went above a D12, right? Like, visually, most of us can identify the difference between a D8 and a D4 is easy. A D6 and a D12 is easy. Even a D10 and a D12 is pretty easy. But the difference between a D16 and a D18 is negligible, right? So it was really easy to get it confused. And then once you started getting up to like a D22, it was just really wonky. And then again, if you've got like, for example, Kijo the Barbarian who does the most base damage, plus adding her power, and then you stacked all these buffs on her, and you're rolling a D24, and then you roll a 1, it sucked. It was not fun at all. So I started looking really heavily into other game systems, especially video games, because they have more sophisticated ways of doing damage. And one of the things you notice in video games, like in an RTS, for example, is a lot of units will have a fixed damage or it'll be a very narrow range, like 6 to 8. And then there's multiple iterations of it. So looking at like video games and other games and thinking about like our experience, our background in wargaming, where you tend to roll lots of dice, it's just fun. It's fun to roll a fistful of dice. Like rolling, a bunch of D6s would be more fun than rolling a D12 in my opinion, right? It just feels more satisfying. So to that end, I decided that we would use modified D6s that had a limited range on them. So for example, the damage dice in the old system, it was a D6, but it had a 0, 2 1s, and 3 2s. And then you would roll a number of those equal to the damage of your weapon plus your power, add it all up. So again, longsword that did D8 would now roll 4 damage dice. And if you were power 2, instead of going up to a D12, you would just add 2 more dice in. It was much simpler. And the end result is that you get a bell curve of results. So the damage is much, much more consistent. Now there still is variability. There is a possibility of doing 0 damage, although it's, it becomes exponentially more difficult the more dice you roll. And maxing out is also much, much more difficult. So you end up with a range in the middle that was more predictable. And you ended up with about 1.33 damage per die rolled. And it made the game infinitely more enjoyable, right? Like, your ranger wasn't popping a key character before he got to do anything, but now it was statistically like, oh, if he shoots him twice, he's going to kill him. But that makes it a lot more manageable. It made the game a lot more fun. This allowed for a lot of flexibility, and like I said, it was just fun. Like, it's fun to roll a bunch of dice, and then as you're adding bonuses, like, oh, and another die, here we go, baby. Like, it just felt fun. And now with armor, super duper simple. For every point of armor you had, you took a die out of the dice pool. Super easy. It made armor super good and reliable and very, very easy. One of the things that I always thought was so silly about D&D was armor increasing how hard it was to hit you. Like, I do get it, like, okay, it's like bouncing off your arm or something, but it just never really felt right to me. It's like armor as damage reduction just feels more, I don't know, it feels like that's what armor should do. So in the end, you have a bell curve of results. Now there's still plenty of variability, but it's, it becomes exponentially less likely to go to the extreme ends of the bell curve, right? You're much more likely to land in the middle. So initially we were using D6s because they're easier and they're cheaper to make from a business aspect. But then when we were using D8s for the action dice, it made sense just to have everything be D8s. So the damage dice went to D8s instead. It didn't really change the math too much. For example, instead of 0, 2 1s, and 3 2s, it was a 0, 3 1s, and 4 2s. So the odds of getting that 0 damage went from 16.6% to 12.5%, if I'm remembering my math correctly. And then it increased the average damage per die up to 1.375. So to balance that out, we increased the HP of the heroes and monsters just by a little bit to offset that, so that all the playtesting we did wouldn't hold true. So to bring this together with the damage dice, as I had noted before, the white dice are the offensive dice, the damage dice is what they're actually called. They have one explosion on them. So when you're using them to modify your action die, you only care about the explosion that increases your odds by 1 in 8 with a reducing amount per additional die. When you're rolling for damage, all the other faces on the white dice are damage, right? They're 1 sword or 2 swords. And then there's a red 2 swords, which I'll explain that in a little bit here. But for all intents and purposes, you're either going to get a 1 or a 2. You add them all together, and that's how much damage you do after subtracting any damage reduction. Super simple. Now, the blue dice or the block dice, which are used as negative modifiers to your action dice, they have a skull on them. Now, in the game, we wanted the opportunity for people to be able to actively defend themselves. It's not fun to just be a passive observer and just watch somebody acting on your models without having anything to do in return. So it was really important to us to have active defense as a possibility. It's not something you do every time. And again, this is probably because we play war games, and in most war games, you have the opportunity to save yourself. And it's fun, right? It skews the math a little bit, and that's why we made it optional in our system. But you want to be able to do something, and then it's like, oh, I did it. No, I didn't do it. It just makes the game more enjoyable. So outside of the passive defenses, which I've already covered, those are static. You can increase them outside of the game as you can with any of your stats. Active defense is a choice that you make. Now, because we wanted it to not be an automatic choice or something you did every single time, they come with a trade-off. Most obvious example is blocking with a shield. So if you opt to block, you gain the hobbled status effect, which means you move half speed. It's meant to represent the fact that hero is really concentrating on blocking with their shield, and as such, they're not moving as quickly. Shields also give you a static evasion bonus, so just so that's clear, just having a shield makes you harder to hit, which we felt was appropriate, but if you're like really trying to use your shield to block, you're going to be slowed down in the game. The other example is parrying with a weapon. This is a lot more, there's a bigger trade-off with this one, and we wanted that to be the case, because if parrying and blocking were the same thing, you would never take a shield, you would just take 2 weapons, because then you can use it offensively as well. It would just be better. So if you choose to parry with a weapon, you can only parry 1 attacking model. You can parry all their attacks, but you can only attack 1 parrying model, or you can only parry 1 attacking model, and then you can't attack with that weapon in your next activation unless it has the defensive keyword, unless you get 1 free parry. So now when you block or parry, you roll half as many block dice as they have damage dice, rounding up, and like symbols cancel out. So let me give you a concrete example. Let's say a hero is hitting a monster, and after going through all the steps, there's 7 damage dice, right? Like say there was 8, the armor had armor 1, so you're down to 7. The monster's AI script tells you to block because it has a shield, just is a hypothetical. Monster would roll 4 blue dice, 4 block dice. The hero's rolling 7 damage dice, which are white. The hero rolls, the monster rolls, like symbols cancel each other out. You don't add it and then subtract it. You don't total them and subtract it. Like symbols cancel out. Now this is important because the block dice have 1 more 1 shield than 2 shields. A 1 shield blocks a 1 sword, a 2 shield blocks a 2 sword. So we didn't want it to, because block active defense is so strong, we didn't want it to be like a straight shot. So we swerved the odds a little bit, and you simply compare them and pull them out. It's actually quicker than adding them up and subtracting. So like if you had to go in and add up all the dice on the white, add up all the blue, and then subtract it, we found that was a lot more mentally intensive than simply going, I have 2 1s. How many 1 shields did you have? I got 1. Cancel 1. I have 2 shields. Oh, I have 3 2 swords. Cancel out 2. Easy peasy. It goes really quick in practice. And lastly, we have an all or nothing active defense, which we included to basically save yourself from getting knocked out or killed. You can dodge a physical attack or resist a metaphysical attack. Both of them are very hard to accomplish. You're going up against a static blue 9 blue dice, so the average modifier is going to be around 3, 4. So it's very difficult. You're usually going to be rolling like 5, 6 negative modifier dice, which means one of them coming up with skull is highly likely. But if you pull it off, you avoid all effects of the attack. It's as if they missed. So really powerful, but if you do that in your next turn, you can only move or defend. You basically can't do much at all your next turn, but it keeps you from getting knocked out. This rule was super fun. It creates some of the most exciting moments in the game. especially like in PvP, for example, you're like, oh, I'm about to take out your fighter. Like, oh no, I don't want him to go. Dodge, I did it. Oh, and everybody goes crazy. It's really fun. Usually it just buys you a turn, but in a game where action economy is king, it forces your opponent to deal with that character one more turn. So lastly, to round out the dice, I did want to cover the raw dice. These are really, really simple. Like I said, they're basically only used when you have critical hits. Some spells use red dice, things like poison or DOTs use red dice. And the way they work, they're exactly like damage dice. They're often used for healing as well, except they have a 3-sword symbol, meaning they go up to being able to do 3 damage or healing, and they don't have a 0, right? So they're just more effective. They can't be blocked. They can't be parried. They ignore damage reduction. They can be dodged, though. They can be resisted. And they're just fun. Like, it actually increased the cost of making the game by quite a bit to include another kind of die in there, but it was so fun during playtesting that we decided it was worthwhile. So when you're playing and you're like stacking all your advantages and then you're getting all your bonuses, like, oh, okay, this character gave me a buff, and then, oh, I got a crit, oh, and then you start building your damage dice pool. It's just fun. You're like, oh, and there's 3 white, 1 more white, oh, and then I got 2 red. It's just fun. So we thought it was well worth it to add it, to get that extra just like sense of excitement, and then plus the color of it, the red color really stands out and it feels powerful. And you know, when you see your opponent throwing those red dice in there, like, oh no, I can't really do anything about it. So they're really simple, and they don't come up all the time, but they're really fun when they do. And then briefly, I want to talk about some of the keywords on weapons, as it's really pertinent to the conversation that we just had. I don't want to go too far into the weeds with it, but just really quickly, we decided to categorize most weapons pretty simply, right? Like a normal hand weapon, like a sword or a mace or an axe, does 4 damage. In order to differentiate them, like why would you take one over the other, we gave, most weapons have a single keyword. They might have 2. But the really common ones, the ones that are pertinent to this conversation, you know, we've already covered things like reach with a spear in the past, which gives you extra range, are the 3 that affect the dice. And I'll cover those really quickly because it's pertinent. So weapons that have the accurate keyword automatically treat swirls on the action dice as a hit. So gives you a pretty significant boost to your odds of hitting. It's really good. Weapons that have the armor piercing keyword, like a mace, for example, and like accurate, the sword has the accurate keyword. The armor piercing keyword lets you automatically activate critical hits. Now that one might sound a little OP, but in practice it's not, because typically speaking, you're not rolling that many dice when you take an action dice check. Because that not only ignores a point of armor, if you get enough of them, it also increases your potential damage. So it's really strong. However, it's pretty rare that you're rolling a ton of white dice with your action dice. But obviously, if you want to increase your perception is what affects your odds to hit. That's going to give you more benefit from the armor piercing keyword. So if you want to make a knight with a mace, giving him high perception is going to get you more mileage out of that keyword. Then we also have the deep wounds keyword. That's going to be most common on like an axe or, you know, a scythe or any sort of weapon that has does a lot of damage. That lets you activate the red 2-sword symbol on the damage dice, which I had mentioned. Those count as 3 damage instead of 2. However, they're still blocked by a 2 shield. So it lets you do more damage at the damage step, which, assuming you hit, the potential output there is can be higher because you can roll a lot of damage dice in the right circumstances. Like, for example, if you have a barbarian with a 2-handed axe and maximum power, you could be rolling a ton of dice. That gives you a lot of opportunities to activate those symbols. And then lastly, I already mentioned it, but I'll touch on it again. If a weapon has the defensive keyword, like Dalanin's parrying dagger, it lets you give 1 parry for free, so you don't have to worry about not being able to use your weapon. And we wanted to include that as an option for a cool, like, semi-defensive weapons. Ooh, baby. So there we go. That's the dice mechanics in Bloodthorn. I know I talked for a long time, but I assure you, in practice, it's extremely simple. Once you do it a couple times, it's completely intuitive. I've taught so many people how to play. I've run demos. I've taught people who aren't really even gamers. And once they get their head wrapped around it, which usually just takes a couple tries, they're doing it so quickly and intuitively because you're not like... You're just looking for those explosions and skulls, and you're comparing a small number to a small number and rolling the dice. It's really simple. And when you're building your damage pool, it's basically weapon damage plus power minus armor, and you're rolling. So, and you're just counting and adding up. So it's a system that hides a lot of complexity underneath the hood, so to speak, but that is very, very easy and quick to use in practice. So I'm really proud of it, actually. And hopefully you like playing it. Well, thank you so much for joining me for episode 10 of Making the Game. I hope you enjoyed it. This was a long one. Again, in the future, I'll try to keep them shorter unless people say they like the longer version, and I'm happy to transition. So if you want to pick up Bloodthorn or back it, it's still available over at GameFound. And we are kind of coming in the last few months that it's going to be open there. And then after that, of course, it will be available retail, although the price will not have the Kickstarter special price. So thank you for listening. I hope you have a great week, and I will talk to you all soon.